Hello again. My name is Pam, and welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February 26th, 2021. And let's begin with our first article. From Savior to Bully. Is Cuomo's hardball style falling out of favor? By Harry Brunius, New York. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, the three-term Democrat who has wielded power in one of the nation's most influential states for over a decade, has long been known for his bare-knuckle backroom style of political leadership. In many ways, the art of intimidation and humiliation has long been part of New York's three men in a room traditions, in which political power tilts towards the deal-making of the governor and the leaders of the state Senate and Assembly. But over the past week, even as revelations about Governor Cuomo's handling of the number of COVID-19 fatalities at New York nursing homes upended his national reputation, the story took a dramatic turn. Members of a newer and younger cohort of state legislatures began to push back against the well-known pit bull tactics of New York's governor. Filled with plot lines of hubris and reversals of fortune, the story of New York's governor over the past year has almost been Shakespearean. And it follows on the heels of the defeat of former President Donald Trump, another politician from New York with a pugnacious brand of swagger, famous for deal making and demanding personal loyalty, who was brought down by the pandemic. The once-in-a-century event has been so big that its attendant problems have stymied politicians of both parties, from managers like Massachusetts Republican Governor Charlie Baker to technocrats like California Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom. But that particularly bellicose style that brought both Mr. Trump and Mr. Cuomo to power has come under fire from a new generation who are not nostalgic for the 1980s. Reputation for pandemic leadership. 1 year ago, Governor Cuomo was becoming as popular as he'd ever been. His daily briefings from the early epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis bipartisan must-see TV. Projecting a leadership style both empathetic and urgent, he inspired celebrity crushes, songs, and memes on social media, and a state counterpoint to what many saw as the federal government's inadequacies, a boon to the vaulting ambition of any would-be presidential aspirant. Everyone in New York had relatives and friends calling from all over the country saying, "Wow, you're governor," says Christina Greer, professor of political science at Fordham University in New York. But at the end of last month, New York's progressive Attorney General Letitia James released a report that found the governor had been undercounting the number of COVID-19 deaths at nursing homes by about 40%, leaving out those residents who died in hospitals. In addition, under his pandemic management, some patients who were diagnosed with the virus were sent back, which some believe may have contributed to the death toll at New York's nursing homes. Governor Cuomo had, in fact, touted New York's low rate of nursing home deaths compared to the rest of the country, a rate based on the incomplete numbers. Then, when confronted with the way his administration categorized its data, he also brusquely dismissed the criticism. But who cares? A percentage died in a hospital, died in a nursing home, Mr. Cuomo said. They died. In the past week, both the FBI and the U.S. Attorney General in Brooklyn have opened preliminary investigations into how the Cuomo administration handled the data from nursing home deaths. A Marist poll released Tuesday found that more than 60% of registered voters believe the governor either acted unethically or illegally with regard to nursing homes. The controversy cut straight to the heart of the kind of leadership skills that made him so celebrated during the early days of the pandemic. It was as if, okay, you misled us about nursing homes, one of our most vulnerable populations. Our bubbies, our nanas, our pop-pops, said Professor Greer. But what else are we being misled about? And his answer raised a lot more questions, and I don't think he's interested in answering them. Albany Machiavelli. But the crisis depended even more when Cuomo lashed out against Assemblyman Ron Kim, a Democrat from Queens, who had been a critic of the governor's handling of nursing home data for months. In public and in private, the governor exploded in a way that longtime observers of New York politics found both familiar and, in many ways, unremarkable. Over the past 35-40 years, almost everyone has had some kind of run in with that side of his personality, says Ken Sherrill, a professor emeritus of political science at Hunter College in New York, noting the governor has had an enforcer's mentality since he was the campaign manager for his late father, the former governor Mario Cuomo. On Wednesday, a former aide detailed allegations of sexual harassment and intimidation against the governor in an essay on Medium. Mr. Cuomo has denied the allegations, and on Wednesday, his spokesman characterized them as false in a statement to the New York Times. A number of Democratic legislators have begun to stand up to the governor's strong arm tactics in ways not necessarily seen in the past, and in some ways signaling less tolerance for the older ways of applying pressure to keep coalitions in line. And despite his reputation as a deft politician, his aggressive, if not abusive, ways of intimidating those who oppose him is out of step with contemporary movements to curb abusive behavior in the workplace, including in professional sports, where a younger generation has rejected the drill sergeant style of leadership. Also on Wednesday, a former aide detailed allegations of sexual harassment. Senator Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins rebuked the governor this month in what observers say was an unusually bold statement criticizing his handling of the nursing home data. A group of 14 Democratic legislators, including Assemblyman Kim, asked the legislature to strip Governor Cuomo of the emergency powers issued during the pandemic. After 4 years of presidential bullying and a toxic White House workplace, many Americans, particularly Democratic voters, seem to have had enough of flatulent, combative public officials, says Stephen Farnsworth, director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Governor Cuomo, once seen as a reassuring voice of professionalism thanks to his effective handling of COVID-19, now seems like an out-of-touch Albany Machiavelli, quick to employ tantrums and cover-ups, he says. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party, too, has promoted an ethos that values cooperation and consensus, eschewing hierarchies in general and resisting political structures that concentrate powers in individual party leaders. There is a new cohort of people who are in power in Albany now, particularly people of color, says Professor Sherrill, noting that women and people of color, all Democrats in this case, together comprise a narrow majority in the 63-member state Senate and 75 of the 150 members of the Assembly. A dramatic change from just a few years ago when white men comprised the demographic majority of both chambers. They are a generation younger than the people who were in power before, and they are not people who would just get used to Andrew being Andrew, the way the previous generation did, Professor Sherrill says. In many ways, the pandemic only masked the profound transformation of the New York legislature. Governor Cuomo has long governed as a fiscal conservative, demanding a restrained budget each year and generally resisting the kinds of progressive proposals that cost money. He's compensated for this with his competence and by having enough liberal positions that people didn't oppose him as much as they might oppose someone who likes to push people around and who does settle scores, Professor Sherrill says. Laws on liberal priorities, such as marriage, equality, and gun control, provided him cover with the Democrats, despite his not having a left-wing economic approach, she adds. And Governor Cuomo was able to find a useful and powerful middle ground between what had long been a Republican-controlled Senate and Democratic Assembly. This is no longer the case, and Democrats now comprise a supermajority in both chambers, including a generation of progressive, eager to spend more and unwilling to tolerate the politics of bullying. People believe this is not the way that a democracy should have to work, says Professor Greer. There are other ways where adults who ostensibly have the People in the forefront of their minds should be able to articulate our vision in a way that's not damaging to our colleagues. We've seen him rise like a phoenix from the ashes before, she continues, but if this iteration of Andrew Cuomo seems to be very strong, very powerful, especially after he became this national figure during COVID, all that goes away, right? If you're saying mission accomplished and we find out that you're cooking the books, all of that goodwill just goes away. Well, this next article is titled Seeds and Beyond, Native Americans Embrace Food Sovereignty by Richard Mertens. In Stoughton, Wisconsin, last spring as COVID-19 swept the nation, Daniel Cornelius planted. A member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, he lives in the rolling farm country south of Madison, where he planted carrots and tomatoes, as well as traditional Native American crops, beans, pumpkins, and corn, in hues ranging from cream to deep red and bearing names like Tuscarora White, Mohawk Yellow, and Bear Island Flint. He helped others plant too. In June, he took his small walk-behind tractor north to help members of the Ladue Flambeau Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa start gardens, heaping the soil in long mounded rows in imitations of traditional planting hills. He brought squash seeds to the reservation of the Menominee Indian tribe of Wisconsin, where members have been building raised beds after ancient Menominee practice. He tapped box elder trees for syrup and gathered wild rice, and in September he brought them to a bartering event on the Oneida Reservation near Green Bay, where he traded them for peppers, quail eggs, and corn soup. Almost everyone wanted that box elder syrup, he says. Mr. Cornelius is part of a growing food sovereignty movement among the Native Americans, an effort aimed at increasing local food production and reviving indigenous agricultural and culinary practices. It's a broad-ranging movement that includes families growing vegetables in backyard gardens and an ever-expanding network of regional and national organizations devoted to fostering intertribal cooperation, sharing agricultural know-how, and promoting the use and preservation of traditional crop varieties. People are hungry, literally hungry to eat these foods, says Mr. Cornelius, who is also a technical advisor for the Intertribal Agricultural Council based in Billings, Montana, and an instructor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But also, in a more figurative sense, they're just hungry for knowledge. For many Native Americans, the return to traditional food is part of a wider effort to decolonize their people, a way to repair the economic and cultural damage inflicted by the European Americans who drove them from their lands, confined them to reservations, sent them to boarding schools, and tried to sever them from their old ways. It means not just planting old seeds, but reviving the economic and cultural life, the ceremonies, the customs, and beliefs around food and food production. In a practical sense, food sovereignty offers a path towards greater self-sufficiency and economic opportunity in poor communities. Perhaps more critical are its potential benefits for public health. Native Americans face high rates of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and other conditions that food sovereignty advocates say result from a dependence on processed foods. We've got to get back to a diet and food system that our bodies and our babies can handle, says Gary Besaw, head of the Department of Agriculture and Food Systems on the Menominee Reservation. Since it emerged a year ago, COVID-19 has given new urgency to these efforts. The coronavirus hit Native American communities hard. In December, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that Native Americans and Alaskan Natives were 3.5 times more likely than white Americans to become infected with the virus. Yet while COVID-19 has revealed the vulnerability of Native peoples, it has also inspired more of them to plant, fish, gather, and hunt. People are seeing the weakness within our current food system, says Rebecca Webster, who with her husband Stephen grows corn and other traditional crops on the Oneida Reservation. They want to know where their food is coming from. They want to take control back. Much of the food sovereignty movement focuses on seeds, growing and preserving them, as well as finding and distributing old and not yet forgotten varieties. Some of this work requires research, like figuring out where a seed company acquired its varieties long ago. It also involves hunting down a variety that someone has been growing and then producing enough seed to share. Organizations like Seed Savers Exchange, based in Decorah, Iowa, and long devoted to promoting heirloom seeds, have in recent years been growing native varieties and sending out seeds to a small number of established growers. In addition, an expanding universe of workshops and YouTube videos is available to teach aspiring growers how to use native agricultural techniques. The Three Sisters. The most popular seeds are the three sisters of indigenous agriculture: corn, beans, and squash. They are traditionally grown together in mounds, as the Websters do on the Oneida Reservation. The corn stalks serve as a trellis for the bean vines, while the beans, which are legumes, enrich the soil for the corn. The squash sprawls out all around. A modification of this strategy is to grow the corn and beans in mounded rows with squash on the ends. Many native growers also plant tobacco and sunflowers. When the pandemic struck, the demand for seeds soared. People had more time at home. They also were rattled by local food shortages. On the Meskwaki settlement in Tama, Iowa, Shelley Buffalo, local foods coordinator for the Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative, grappled with a huge increase in requests for seeds. There were many people who were gardening for the first time, she says. Appeals to the traditional Native American Farmers Association nearly depleted what we had, said Clayson Brascu, a farmer in Tesauqua Pueblo, New Mexico, and the group's program director. There were people contacting us from a lot of new places, he said. They said, "Can you send seed?" But it's not all about seeds. Native Americans are also raising bison, spearing fish, picking chokecherries, harvesting wild rice, and much more. It's a movement that touches every tribe in the United States and reflects both the geographical and historical diversity of Native American communities. The Quapaw Nation of Oklahoma raises bison on lands recovered from lead and zinc mining and operates its own meat processing plant. The Muckleshoot of Washington State have hosted workshops on how to fillet a salmon and slice up an elk. Nadi Bikya of People's Farm is trying to revive agriculture among Arizona's White Mountain Apache. Minnesota's Red Lake Ojibwe sell mail-order wild rice and chokeberry jam. And in Hugo, Minnesota, just outside the Twin Cities, the organization Dream of Wild Health teaches Native children how to garden. A program for teenagers is called Garden Warriors. This year was a big wake-up call for our tribe, says Greg Johnson, a member of the Ladue Flambeau Band and an expert in cooking muskellunge, a predatory fish found in northern lakes, which he does by wrapping it in birch bark and baking it under the ground under a fire. Mr. Johnson says that worries over the food supply sent twice the number of his band than usual out to spear walleye pike in northern Wisconsin lakes late last spring, a tradition among his people. More people hunted deer later in the year. He taught some of them how to can the venison. In many respects, for me, it was really good to see that, he says. There were people you never thought would get wild rice. There were people who you never thought would get wild medicines. It was really incredible. Chef participation, too. Getting the food is only part of the movement. A growing number of chefs are promoting native cuisine, among them Sean Sherman of Oglala, Lakota, and recipient of a James Beard Award, the founder and CEO of the Sous Chef business in Minneapolis. Mr. Sherman directs a food lab devoted to teaching native culinary approaches. COVID-19 delayed his plans to open a restaurant, but it inspired a new form of outreach: ready-to-eat meals prepared in the Twin Cities and distributed to Native communities around the region. By December, a crew of 24 workers was sending 6,000 meals a week. It distributed 500 meal kits before the holidays, including the fixings for what Mr. Sherman describes as a native grain bowl. Oh, here's a good word: Potawatomi corn, bison meat, dried blueberries, and puffed wild rice. That was a fun one, he said. Efforts to revive native foods are not new. Mr. Brascu recalls an intertribal meeting in Gallup, New Mexico in 1992, at which older farmers voiced concerns about their dwindling numbers. They also saw a decline in people's health, he said. They tied those two together. In the years since Mr. Brascoup has seen a steady increase in the ranks of native farmers, and what started as a rural movement, he says, has moved to cities where many Native Americans live, to community gardening and programs teaching native gardening and culture to children. Mr. Brascoup attributes much of the resurgence not to tribal initiatives, which have become widespread, but to younger individuals carrying on the work of their elders. Once a young farmer himself, he now has grandchildren who farm. A lot of what we see now started with young people, Mr. Brascoup says. It was more from the bottom up than the top down, from tribal governments. Indeed, the food sovereignty movement builds upon the perseverance, and determination of individuals and families who have worked over many years to keep native food traditions alive. One of these people is Luke Capello, who grew up on the Meskwaki settlement. When I was growing up, all of us, we had to help with the gardens, he recalls. Most of the families had their own gardens. As Mr. Capello got older, however, he noticed that fewer people were gardening, and those still doing it were planting fewer old varieties, mainly just corn, the most prized of native foods. He resolved to keep growing traditional beans and squash, and he began to seek out other varieties both on and off the settlement. He consulted old ethnographies. ethnographies. He even tried unsuccessfully to track down seeds at the New York Museum. Most of the seeds that me and my family are growing in our garden are what my parents and grandparents were growing, he says. They've been growing for 1,000 years. I don't know. I think I believe these seeds are sacred. They're very special. It makes me want to keep growing them, and I want to make sure our kids keep growing them. Plenty of challenges. Despite its successes, the food sovereignty movement still faces plenty of challenges. Growing old crop varieties can be labor intensive. If done in the traditional way, they are planted and harvested by hand, with the three main crops, corn, beans, and squash, planted together. Also, growers need to take care that nearby field crops, especially corn, don't cross-pollinate with traditional varieties. And it takes time to preserve the foods, usually by drying, and to cook them up in traditional dishes such as corn soup, which Mr. Capello prepares outside in an old kettle over a wooden fire. In addition, efforts to take advantage of native treaty rights for hunting and fishing continue to meet resistance, as when a group of non-native people harassed Mr. Johnson while he speared walleye at a Wisconsin lake late last April. Nor is it easy to get people to renounce modern processed foods. Nikki Buck knows this well. A member of the Prairie Island India community in Minnesota, she grew up behind a McDonald's and ate sugar sandwiches as a kid, and developed kidney disease as an adult. Today, she eats and promotes native foods in her community. You just have to retrain your palate, she says. You have to decolonize your palate. Decolonizing the palate of the young poses a special challenge. Parents make sloppy joes out of bison meat and substitute flint corn for wheat pasta. Ms. Webster, the mother of two teenage daughters, says, "We're trying to show that corn is cool enough even though there's a frozen pizza looking at them." The gardening itself may occasion a complaint from younger ones, but it's good family time. Indeed, the food sovereignty movement is often about bringing people together, growing, harvesting, trading seeds and food, and of course, eating. A native food cooperative on the Oneida Reservation has 15 member families and saw more applications to join last year than ever before. There are a lot of folks showing interest, says Leah Zeese, who manages the co-op. A year-round effort. Food sovereignty is a year-round effort. Over the winter, Gardeners have been cooking up what they harvested and preserved in the fall: the dried beans, the canned venison, the corn boiled and dried and stored in glass jars. In northern Wisconsin, members of the Ladue Flambeau Band were busy with winter spearing, chopping holes through 28 inches of ice to get to the fish. "We're going to get as many muskies as we can," says Mr. Johnson. "We have a lot of younger people who want to do this." Others are looking forward to spring, planning their gardens, shelling dried corn for seed, and in some cases looking beyond the pandemic to a resumption of the workshops and conferences that have helped spread the food sovereignty movement. "People can't wait to get together," says Mr. Cornelius. In the meantime, Mr. Cornelius, like other food sovereignty advocates, is heavily booked on Zoom. He's also full of plans for his own farming. In midwinter, he was thinking he should plant his greenhouse soon. He was also trying to figure out how to tap more trees in early spring, including a stand of silver maples on land he just bought last year. 51 acres, mostly woods, plus the derelict buildings of an old dairy farm. He hopes to bring in cattle. His friends says he should raise bison. Maybe someday, he tells them. One step at a time, he says. And now let's talk about points of progress. New Zealand recognizes Maori New Year and more by Lindsay McGuinness. New Zealand has made Matariki and Maori New Year celebration the first public holiday that honors Maori culture. Matariki is the Maori name for the Pleiades star cluster, which rises in the southern hemisphere around midwinter. This historically marks the start of the new year for mainland New Zealand's indigenous people. Local councils have been organizing Matariki celebrations and raising awareness about the tradition since the early 2000s, but past efforts to recognize the constellation's reappearance as an official holiday have failed. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced the first official Matariki will be celebrated June 24, 2022, and future dates will be determined by the newly formed Matariki Advisory Group in compliance with the Maori lunar calendar. It will also advise on how to celebrate the event, considering regional differences in tribes, traditions, and develop resources to educate the public about Matariki's meaning, says Chair Rangiahinu Matamua, a professor who specializes in Maori astronomy. In the world, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is set to become the first African and first woman to hold the top position at the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, and many see her appointment as a historic validation of African women's competency and leadership. The Nigerian economist has a reputation as a strong international negotiator with a commitment to reducing poverty and improving transparency. She became an American citizen in 2019. Selecting a new director general requires approval by all WTO members, and Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's path was cleared after President Joe Biden reversed the previous administration's objection to her candidacy. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala is taking over the WTO during turbulent times marked by member infighting and the ongoing coronavirus. Well, friends, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February 26, 2021. My name is Pam, and I want to thank you for having me into your home today. Please be safe until we meet here again. Be blessed, and make it a great day.